invention of the telephone. In 1876, Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone.
Ma quando mai?
Revolutionizing communication.
Ma assolutamente no.
The world's first telephone was invented by Alexander Graham Bell in
Ancora
1876.
questa
First
storia.
ever call to his assistant.
The late 19th century, Alexander Graham Bell invented the first telephone.
Ancora niente, c'è
Bell's
niente da
invention
fare.
revolutionized communication, allowing people to speak across
Ma
long
va,
distances.
ma va.
You see? You see what I'm talking? Antonio Meucci invented the telephone and he got robbed. Everybody knows that.
Welcome to a How to Italy special series, Great Italian Americans. Buongiorno a tutti ragazzi, Luca here, professor of history and enthusiast of Italian culture. Normally, the first time people arrive in New York, the very first thing they do is to go and see the Statue of Liberty, or Times Square, or the Yankee Stadium. You know what I did the first time I arrived in New York? None of these things. I took a ferry from Manhattan because I immediately had to go to Staten Island to pay tribute to a great Italian and Italian American, the real inventor of the telephone, even if most of the people don't know that, Antonio Meucci. Antonio Meucci was born in Florence in 1808, the first of a family of 9 children of modest economic conditions. The financial difficulties which would mark his entire life in a decisive way started immediately when Antonio, despite showing a very precocious scientific talent, had to drop from the engineering school because he was unable to pay the fees. Despite these difficulties, Antonio continued his studies on his own until he received his first job offer, technician at the La Pergola Theatre in Florence. During this experience there, 2 fundamental things happened in Meucci's life. First, he tested the first acoustic phone. Basically, with this tool, workers in different parts of the theater could communicate remotely. And second, but not of less importance, Meucci met his future wife, Esther, who worked as tailor in the same theater. The success at the La Pergola Theatre in Florence brought Meucci and his wife the commission of a lifetime, the Great Theatre of Cuba, in which Esther found a very good job as a seamstress and Antonio as chief engineer of the theatre. But we'll see that during the nearly 15 years in Havana, the only ones in which Antonio's life was not affected by economical struggles, Meucci's talent would extend way beyond the simple renovation and maintenance of the theater. He was a real genius. In Cuba, Meucci's talent just went above and beyond. He was involved in so many enterprises that's really hard to believe, from the complete renovation of the opera house to the complete filtering of the dirty waters of the local aqueduct, to experiments in order to increase the conservation of dead bodies during transportation, and also, very importantly, experiments with electrostimulation as a cure for certain diseases, including that rheumatoid arthritis that was the disease his wife Esther was suffering from. So it was, at the time, he was already a very well established and respected Italian scientist with a multifaceted talent. And during one of these experiments with electroshock on sick people, he made a tremendously important discovery. Those same electrical impulses he was using to care and to treat people could be used to transport the voice from a place to another.
Taking up the 2 instruments, the one held by the individual and my own, I did enclose them in a wrapping of cardboard so as to insulate the tongue from contact with the flesh. I instructed the patient to repeat the operation without fear, assuring him he would suffer no harm from the electricity, and bade him speak freely into the wrapping. He placed his wrapping to his mouth, and I placed mine to my ear. At the moment the individual spoke, I received the sound of his word, not distinct, but a murmur, an inarticulate sound. I had him repeat the experiment several times that day, and thereafter on different days, ever obtaining the same result. It was at that moment that my imagination was stirred, for I discerned that I had achieved the transmission of the human voice by means of a conducting wire, connected to various batteries to generate electricity. To this invention I gave the name forthwith, the speaking telegraph.
At this point, we are already in 1850 and Antonio is already 42. Meucci declared his intention to use up all his savings, fruit of his job in Cuba, and move to New York. But why did he do that at the age of 42, so not young for the 19th century? There were three major reasons. The first reason is that New York at the time was a booming metropolis, full of opportunities and people ready to finance talents like Meucci. If there was a place where someone could believe in the crazy project of the Tuscan inventor, that was the Big Apple. The second, but historians and biographers are not completely sure about that, is that it appears to be that Meucci lost his only daughter at the age of 6 the year before moving to New York. So this could be another reason, but again, we're not 100% sure. The third reason, which is actually very dear to me because this is exactly what I studied for my PhD, is a more sentimental one. You have to understand that Antonio Meucci was a great patriot. In a period, the mid-1800s, in which Italy did not exist, it was just an aspiration of paper, many patriots fleeing political persecution in Italy fled to New York. One of these, probably the most important one, Giuseppe Garibaldi, hero of the future Italian unification and founding father of my country, was a very close friend of Antonio Meucci, and when Antonio settled for good in his house in Staten Island, the first thing he did was to host Garibaldi for nearly 1 year. And not only him, basically Meucci House became like a hub for all the Italian patriots who were staying in New York. It was like a little Italy in Staten Island. It was a very important place for the Italian patriotic movement in New York. And this is something I really want to make a video about because it's a very interesting story and I know a lot about this. In New York, things started to go really, really bad, really fast. While Antonio was continuing his experiments on the future telephone, everything else fell apart. The money invested first in a candle factory and then in a brewery completely evaporated. This was also due to the fact that Antonio, as I said before, was like a hub for all the Italian community in New York. He lended money to a lot of fellow Italians, but this money never came back, so there was a huge economic struggle. Furthermore, Esther's rheumatoid arthritis worsened, so the wife couldn't move from her bed anymore. So Antonio, with his ingenuity, had to invent a system in order to communicate from different rooms of the house without moving.
It consists of a vibrating diaphragm and a magnet electrified by a spiral wire that wraps around it. The vibrating diaphragm alters the current of the magnet. These alterations of current transmitted to the other end of the wire create analogous vibrations of the receiving diaphragm and reproduce the word.
According to one of his most important biographers, communication engineer Basilio Catania, Antonio had just changed the world because he invented something very similar to a modern telephone, and this despite the continuous misfortunes that happened throughout all his life. Many of these we didn't even mention because there were too many things to say. Despite all of this, he changed the world. But this is what we know now in 2024, and not even all of us. Back in the day, Meucci's life was such a mess. There was this misfortune that gripped him until the very last days of his life. In that period, he was so anxious to secure this invention by finding some financiers that basically every day he was going back and forth from Staten Island to Manhattan. But one of these days, the ferry exploded and he was seriously injured to his leg. So another thing to think about, because the injury was serious and never really healed until his death. At the end of the day, he managed to find two financiers, not two big ones, two couple of Italian Americans with whom he established a company called Teletrofono. But once again, the financial struggles proved decisive. Not even a year after the company was founded, it went bankrupt because of lack of money, so Meucci was unable to file the $250 patent that would have protected his invention for a very, very long time. So what did he do? He was forced to file a caveat, which basically was a weaker version of the patent, in which the author described very loosely the invention and announced that sooner or later he would have filed the real patent. It was like an announcement, but it was an extremely weak and general document that did not protect Meucci at all. First, because it had to be renewed basically every year, and also because sharks of New York could have easily claimed an invention that was very, very similar to this caveat. And this is exactly what happened.
All these, to wit, the mouth utensil and the ear instruments, communicate to the wire at a short distance from the persons. The ear utensils, being of a convex form like a clock glass, enclose the whole exterior part of the ear and make it comfortable for the operator. The object is to bring distinctly to the hearing the word of the person at the opposite end of the telegraph. I claim as my invention and desire to have considered as such for all the purposes of this caveat.
And at that point, this was just a race against time. Meucci was so scared and frightened that his invention could be used by someone else because of this very weak caveat that he filed, that he was desperately looking for bigger financiers that could put in place the invention on a much bigger scale, so that once the telephone was broadly adopted, no one could have said anything to him. So he went to some New York big investors, but he just went straight in the mouth of the shark. So Meucci turned to a very big New York company that had become increasingly rich and powerful because it was the contractor of Samuel Morse's magnetic telegraph invented a few years ago. This company was called American District Telegraph & Co. And one of the consultants of this company, whose task was theoretically to help Meucci developing the telephone on a much bigger scale, was a Scottish immigrant. He was called Alexander Graham Bell. The rest, unfortunately, is history.
Who invented the telephone? Nikola Tesla, Thomas Edison, Alexander Graham Bell, or Guglielmo Marconi. The correct answer is Alexander Graham Bell. Explanation: Alexander Graham Bell was credited with inventing the first practical telephone in 1876.
And at this point, things become very controversial and, personally, I have to say, very sad. Hundreds of trials have been held and thousands of pages have been written without anyone finding a truth that is good for everyone. The drawings of the future telephone that Antonio gave to the American District Telegraph Company at the time when he was convinced that these guys could help him just disappeared. For 2 years, Antonio tried to get them back without success, and the lack of this evidence in the trial against Alexander Bell proved decisive.
You are my help. Alexander Graham Bell.
Not even 2 years after this material disappeared in 1876, Alexander Graham Bell coincidentally filed a full patent attributing to him the paternity of the telephone. This patent, thanks also to the money and power and influence that Bell managed to accumulate, has resisted more than 500 lawsuits challenging its paternity and originality. The two most important trials were the one against Elisha Gray, another inventor who had worked a lot with Alexander Bell, especially during the period in which the two were supposed to help Meucci spreading the invention of the telephone at the American District Telegraph Company. And the other one was unfortunately against Meucci himself, but boy, this period of the trial for him was an apocalypse, was a trail of tears. He was completely penniless. He was seriously sick. His wife was dying. This trial was a nightmare for him. Just to let you understand the circumstances, he was defended pro bono by a young Italian-American lawyer who was an orphan that Meucci took care of during the period in Staten Island in his house. Meucci just did not stand a chance against Alexander Bell. He was poor, he was sick, he was old, he was Italian, which was not exactly an advantage, as Italian Americans know very well, in late 19th century. When he died, the trial was just closed, and it was said by the court that Meucci had just invented a mechanical intercom, which in my opinion doesn't make any sense because Meucci was an absolute master in electricity. He showed it in Cuba and in many other experiments throughout his whole life. In fact, also the most important Italian-American historian, Giovanni Ermenegildo Schiavo, defined this probably one of the biggest mistakes in the history of the American justice system. In the meantime, because life is very unfair, Alexander Graham Bell, a few years later, founded a company called Bell Phone Company. In a while, this company evolved in AT&T, the biggest communication company in the world. And then we get more or less to the present day. In 2002, the Italian-American US representative Vito Fossella passed at the House a resolution which said, and I'm quoting, "The life and achievements of Antonio Meucci should be recognized and his work in the invention of the telephone should be acknowledged." But despite this commendable resolution, the invention of the telephone remains very disputed, and most of the people still think that it was Bell, because this resolution doesn't clearly say that Meucci was the inventor of the telephone. They can't, even if it was true, they can't, because there would be a mess even with the Canadian house, because Canadians adopted Bell because he went to Canada from Scotland before going to the US, and there would be a lot of problems with the school programs to change completely. But at least they're saying, okay, we know who Antonio Meucci was, how great this man was, and you know what, at least on this channel, even if billions of people will still be taught that Alexander Bell was the inventor of the phone, on this channel we know who was the real genius, and that's important for me. Grazie Antonio.